Why did the ancient Hyperboreans of the Arctic send Avaris to Greece? We know that the Hyperboreans sent something to Greece that was used by Alexander the Great about 330 BC, and that was the lightning rod of Zeus. There was a writing by Plato having to do with a column, an engraved column that was left at the eastern coast of China, saying that King Alexander had arrived at the coasts of China at that position across the sea from Japan, and that the message written on there said that the King Alexander had properly concealed and hidden the lightning rod of Zeus, the hyper weapon that he used. It must have been some kind of a laser weapon. Now, a copy of that is in one of the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries of Nepal. And this is what it looks like. And that's a copy of it, right there. That is a copy of the lightning rod of Zeus that Alexander the Great had, and that he hid, and he had gotten all the way to the end of China. And it sits here, a copy of it, in one of the Buddhist monasteries in Nepal. Now, I'm translating this from a Greek article having to do, again, with Hyperborean, written by a professor of archaeology of Greek University. Now, in the semicircle from the Don River to the Danube estuary, dozens of Scythian tribes had developed relationships with the ancient Greeks from very, very early years, already before colonization, from the Mycenaean era and the early Iron Age to the proto-geometric years, that is from 1040 to about 7000 BC. We conclude that visits to Greeks should have been frequent in these places, even though most of our sources come from mythology. However, despite the charm that Greek culture exerted on the Scythians, and despite the relentless introduction of innumerable Greek ceramics and metal products, despite the dense trade relations and constant contact with the Greeks of colonial centers in the northern Black Sea and the Black Sea creation of the Greek Cypriot population, speaking a mixed Greek Cypriot language as early as 450 BC, that's when Herodotus visited Scythia, the Scythian culture did not go through the process of recording the language. The nation which held the most important gold sources in the north of the homeland maintained the prosperous and dynamic character of the rider team and remained firmly committed to its traditions. Riders, the Scythians had horses. This is well before they came into the area of ancient Greece. And we know, for example, 500 BC, the Greeks didn't have horses. They came in later on. For example, in the Battle of Marathon, the Persians had horses. The Greeks didn't have horses. And obviously the Persians were feared because they had a cavalry, and they had cavalry archers, okay? Whereas the Greeks had the phalanx and their brass armor. So later on, they got horses through trade, and that's when, of course, Alexander the Great did have a horse. His name was Vucephalus, because it had such a huge head. It was like the head of an oxen. So vos is cattle in Greek. So yes, the tribes, the rider teams, meaning the people that were horse riders, and they remained firmly committed to these traditions. It's particularly noteworthy that throughout the regions, kings, rulers, and the ruling class of barbaric peoples used the Greek language and script whenever they had to write something. They were writing it in the Greek language. The Greek language, the carrier of ancient Greek culture, of political and religious institutions, of Greek thought and philosophy, but also of the international language of commerce and diplomacy, served as the most important link between the inhabitants of the north, and also as a motive to entice them to visit mainland Greece and the greater Greek area. Herodotus about 34, D34 tells us about the offering sent by the peoples of the north to Delos. The island of Delos was an island full of temples, for their travels, their country, and their religion. The people of Delos, the Delians, recount that the North Koreans, okay, from North Korea, sent the tenders wrapped in a wheat reed, and that for the first time they sent two daughters, the Magnificent and the Laodicean. Okay, the names are actually Magnificent Hyperborean in Greek, meaning beautiful, beautifully, very, very beautiful, and Laodike, not Laodicean, Laodike, and to give their offerings. Okay, they were carrying the offerings, and these two daughters, when these two daughters died, they were buried in the sanctuary of Artemis in Delos, in the island of Delos, where the daughters and the children, quote unquote, lay their hair, which they cut when they got married. The Delians also say that two other daughters came earlier, Argis and Ipis, came to bear the tax that they imposed on the goddess Eletheus for the good birth of Lito, meaning having a successive childbirth. Indeed, in D35 it said that the women of Delos referred to the names of these two virgins in a hymn composed by their honorary Lycian ode. Olin composed other old hymns, which are sung in Delos. Herodotus mentions Aaron, Aaron, who came echoing on an arrow, and the Hyperboreans, as they were called by the ancient Greeks, from the years of Hesiod and Pindar, were the inhabitants of the far north, of the Arctic, where many paradoxical legends circulated, probably due to the dark, foggy, and unknown area they inhabited. And going on with the article, they were justifying saying that they ate no meat and lived for 1,000 years, and that they were in constant war against the grumpy, imaginary animals that threatened to rob their country's gold. Okay, thousands of years. We know that the Atlanteans were also in the Arctic Hyperborea, and that they lived very long lives. They had longevity. According to Strabo, about 507, c. 507, the northern Greeks called the ancient Greeks the peoples living north of the Black Sea and Istros and the Danube. It has been the subject of many paradoxical stories. Avaris is rumored to be one of the apostolic priests of Apollo who urged him to visit Greece, and according to the Neoplatonists, and especially in his work, quote, on the Pythagorean life, and quote, Iamblichus called him a Scythian, who came from overseas, being infinite in Greek education, unfazed and advanced in age. So he approached the Pythagoreans to learn Greek philosophy. Pythagoras then, in order to introduce him to various Pythagorean theories, did not apply the pedagogical method of education, but the 5-year silence and other trials, but in a short time taught him the books on nature and on the gods. Avaris continued the text, emphasizing and repeating his extraterrestrial ancestry. Okay, did you hear that? Okay, Avaris continued written in the text, emphasized and repeated his extraterrestrial ancestry, was old and very wise, that he had come to Greece and at that time returned to his homeland, but he wandered off and the road brought him to Italy, where he saw Pythagoras and found that there was no other human like him. He gave Pythagoras an arrow, which Avaris had kept it from the time he left his country. Avaris had used this arrow because riding this he could overcome all the difficulties he would encounter during his wanderings. So it was possible to cross the waterways, that is the rivers, the lakes, swamps, mountains. Pythagoras says Iamblichus accepted the arrow as something natural, as if waiting for it, without being surprised or asking him why he gave it to him, but took Avaris and showed him his thigh, which was gold. That's showing him proof, giving him proof that he did not make a mistake in giving him this arrow. Okay? He showed him his thigh, which was golden, showing him that he was not wrong in giving him the arrow. Then Pythagoras listed Avaris one by one, recounted to Avaris one by one all that is in the sanctuary of the Apollo suburb, and assured him that everything was exactly like that. He also asked him to stay in Italy and teach those he met. So he stayed close to Pythagoras, who taught him philosophy briefly, and instead of oscillating with the sacrifices, handed him the prognosis by numbers because he believed it to be the most pure. Other exercises of the spirit and most appropriate were given to Avaris. And apart from the Pythagorean philosophy, Avaris was also introduced to the Orphic philosophy. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, whose mother had introduced him to Mount Pangaeon, also taught Pythagoras and taught him that number is the definite essence of the gods, and that through the numbers it's foreseen that a future will happen. In turn, Pythagoras taught all of this to Avaris and taught him that instead of guessing with blood and slaughter and safest knowledge is through numbers, quote, he taught him a perfect knowledge of all the truth, which was deduced through arithmetic science, end quote. And according to legend, Avaris was never seen drinking or eating anything. Once Phalaris, the cruelest of the tyrants in the cities of Greater Greece, captured Avaris and Pythagoras captive, for he saw them talking, and why Avaris, instead of admiring the tyrant, admired Pythagoras, and asked him many questions, and above all, of sacred nature, such as what is the concern of gods for humans, and what are statues related to, and should they be worshipped, and what are the celestial bodies and those that orbit the earth, and much more. Pythagoras continued to teach Avaris, the extraterrestrial, that all things depend on and are governed by the power of God, and that the power of the soul dominates the freedom of the will. He continued to discuss in detail the perfect energy of the rational and the mind, the brazenness of speech, tyranny, fortune, injustice, human greed, and concluded that all worldly things are worthless. He then gave him divine advice on good life and compared it to corrupt life, revealing to him that illnesses and other major calamities of the body are the fruits of adultery. He revealed to him the distinction between those that come from the destiny and the immanent and those that come from the mind. In this way, then, Avaris embarked on Pythagorean philosophy and learned its main doctrines, and must have been one of the most important Pythagoreans. Legends and sources do not say whether he returned to his country of origin to relay the philosophy taught. He would most likely return and transmit them to the Pythagorean philosophy, and in particular the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, for which the Scythians were known in antiquity. This is by Professor of the Athens University, Voula Lampropoulou, and it's on Diadrastika that I've just translated to you from Greek. So Avaris was an extraterrestrial. Nobody ever saw him eating or drinking. He's not described here as to what he looked like. I assume that he looked like a human, and because we're not told that he doesn't look human, and we were not told where he came from. So he was sent to Greece to be educated by Pythagoras. And he was to return to his homeland, presumably, since he was extraterrestrial, some other planet, to describe to them this Pythagorean philosophy and the belief in one God. And tell me what you think about this. I never knew about this Avaris and extraterrestrial entity until just today. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.